asked me to speak, I said, you know, to be honest with you, I am not interested in giving a hurrah, hurrah speech. Can I be me? And she said, go ahead, be you. When I was 9 years old, my parents packed our bags and traveled nearly 5,000 miles to go from Lomé, Togo. Can anybody tell us where is that? Togo. My man. Say it loud.
West Africa.
Yes. And arrived in New York. We left our food, our clothes, our family, our culture, and our way of life. And we did it all in pursuit of opportunity and education. My parents made this sacrifice so my brothers and I could gain access to the privileges of the first world. When we arrived, we were 2 grades ahead of our peers. But for social reasons, most of my brothers and I only skipped 1 grade. I tell you this because with only welfare checks to our names, we found ourselves attending low-income public schools, where my brothers and I were dismayed at the low expectations and standards for teachers and students alike. At the time, I blamed the deficiency of my peers and their inability to solve the simplest math problems on their natural inferiority. The colonization of my mind and internalized self-hatred was already taking place. But you see, I'm an African. My history is that my people were kings and queens before I was ever taught we were slaves. So you have to understand, resistance has always been my natural mode of operation. But it wasn't until my sophomore year in college when I learned the words social construct and hegemony. That's when I began to contextualize the violence I was subjugated to in the American public education system. You see, hegemony is ruled through consent. It's how the dominant culture manufactures the consent from the oppressed classes. It's how they sell us their lived experiences, their realities as the reality. As this critical consciousness was awakened, my theory of change developed and solidified my resolve for education as the space in which I can work sustainably towards equity and justice for historically marginalized communities while staying true to my authentic self. These words are taken directly from my vision this year, and I share that with you because I'm going to describe a very specific moment in the year that I think was transformational for me and my students. 3 weeks into the school year, I asked my students to list their top frustrations with their school. Uniforms, cell phones, homework, and discipline were among the favorites. With this list, I asked them if they have ever felt their requests heard. After the resounding no, I asked who among them would be willing to stand up, walk out of class, protest in front of the school building to voice their opinions. A few kids rose their hands enthusiastically. I then listed the consequences that would follow and how I, as a member of the system, would respond. I would radio for an admin. I would instruct them that kids had walked out of class. They would be given 3 demerits, that's detention. If they were defiant when asked to return, they could face suspension, even, hey, who knows, expulsion. If they still refused to move, we would call the security officer. If they still refused or couldn't be taken forcibly down by the police would be called in and they could face potential charges. So the scholars, which is one of my favorite questions to ask them, what you gonna do? In my first period class, the students put their hands down in fear. In my second period class, 6 or so kids stood up after receiving the challenge, but quickly sat back down in fear. See, I was trying to teach them how I could control them without ever laying my hands on them. My fourth period was a bit more bold at first, but ultimately feeble. I appreciate that. Thank you. At first word, about 15 students rose up, ready to charge the doors. After hearing the consequences, 6 of them sat back down, begrudgingly. But 9 walked out of my class and headed for the front entrance. I was surprised at that point, so I clutched the radio and I blurted, AOD, that means admin on duty. You'll learn your acronyms. AOD, are you on the radio? A few students just walked out of my classroom. The admin, who was a nice white lady, she met the kids at the front entrance with their daring hands on the door handle. She calmly asked the students, could you please return to the classroom? Like clockwork, the students nodded, apologized, and calmly returned. Let me tell you why this angered me as their educator. One, their resulting reflections were that they didn't truly feel that passionately about uniforms, cell phones, or even fairness. They were disorganized, they lacked any solidarity or clarity in their micro-movement. My 3 resulting reflections. 1, how in the world would I ever trust these children to advocate for their community? 2, what if learning about these inequities oppressing their communities was not enough fuel? 3, damn, all this nice white lady had to do was ask nicely. Where was all that angsty revolutionary 8th grade spirit? Where is all that fight? I call what my students did rational decision making. They had a cause they barely believed in, and ultimately they chose the path of least resistance. They showed me their true colors though. When 4 months later, I got a phone call about 7 p.m. Wednesday night. Illyria, one of my favorite students, she said, Mr. Amuzu, I told my mother we want to walk out in solidarity with the Ferguson protest. And she said, call Mr. Amuzu, he'll help you. If you get anything from this speech, be that teacher that that parent knows is unequivocally on their side. No matter whether you agree with the issue my students took up, there is nothing transformative you have to agree about an education which develops habits of cowardice. Courage is not an option for students of color who must face, disrupt, and ultimately uproot deeply entrenched systemic inequities in their community. Courage is necessary. It's necessary for students to speak truth to power. It's necessary for them to actualize their dreams of becoming agents of change. And our rhetoric. Courage is not an option for a first-year corps member with little to no teaching experience set to the task of transforming Colorado's education system with grace and with humility. Courage is necessary for you. When you teach your class the word oppression, are you going to have the courage to witness their pain? When you ask them to tell you something most people don't know about them, will you have the courage to listen? When you step into a diversity session at Institute and you hear a corps member speak with the blind, suffocating presence of unknowing and unaware privilege, are you going to have the courage to speak truth to power? When one of 3 white students in your school starts self-harming and tells his mother he doesn't want to be white anymore because of all the injustices he's learning about in your class, and when that mother, who you thought was white, comes in righteously angry and furious at you, and she comes in and you just now realize the hot mess you're in because she's not white. She's actually African American with an adopted white child. Yeah, that's complicated. Are you going to have the courage to speak truth to power then? When you see your school using structures and systems developed in the military to get black and brown kids to college, will you have the courage to speak truth to power then? When a corps member says, TFA wants me to feel bad for being white, will you find the patience to forgive ignorance and speak truth to power? When a tormented black young 13-year-old girl runs out of another teacher's classroom and screams in the comments, with all of her righteousness, she says, for every adult in the building to hear, she says, I hate white people. Are you going to have the courage to speak truth to power? It wasn't pretty, but I'm proud of my students who took a step towards action. They summoned enough courage to actually push that door when history came knocking. They walked out. They forced every educator who did nothing for Trayvon. They did nothing for Ferguson, nothing for Eric Gardner, nothing for Jesse Hernandez. They woke us all out of the slumber and docility invoked by the tranquilizing effect of hokey hope. You don't know it yet, but there's a lethal dope that your school peddles. It's called hokey hope. We tell kids that if they can just walk in a straight and silent line and shut up long enough for us to see a return on our investment on that damn standardized test, then everything will be okay. Duncan Andrade calls that dope schools peddle hokey hope. When my students chanted, turn up, don't turn down, we do this for Mike Brown, that was critical hope. That was a symbol of an education that relieves suffering in communities. They spoke truth to power. And best of all, they did it without losing their swag.
Nice.
I teach my students that swag, please repeat after me, is something we all got. So what is swag?
Something we all got.
If you're here to be a conformist, then your swag involves being another cog in the machine. If you're here to take to heart this mission of transformative change, transformative resistance, what Jen Bacon calls a life or death endeavor, expect bruises. You are literally attempting to resist against a machine that works very well. The system isn't broken, it just wasn't designed for people who look like me or come from my community. There's one question I'm thinking about as I meet all of you tonight. My question for you is the same question that Professor Eddie Glaude Jr. spoke about in 2011 at the reception for people of color. When history comes knocking at your doorstep, whether it's at institute, whether it's during your first semester of teaching, your second year, your third year, your fifth year of teaching, whether it's in a boardroom, in a courthouse, you look like you have lots of ambition, maybe it's the Oval Office, who knows? And the question is, will you have the courage to speak truth to power, to will the transformation of these systems, to call out white supremacy, to call out heteronormativity, class privilege, to call out the patriarchy, these systems of oppression oppressing my community? The question is, will you step into your charge, or will you use TFA as just a moment towards your own pursuit of self-interest? Will you have the courage to speak truth to power, to look your principles in the face, to call out injustices? What you gonna do?